start this video, we need to define some terms. First one being habeas corpus. According to Wikipedia from medieval Latin, that you have the body is a recourse in law by which a report can be made to a court in the events of unlawful detention or imprisonment, requesting that the court orders the person's custodian, usually a prison official, to bring the prisoner to court to determine whether their detention is lawful. This first paragraph is a primary example of the corporate propaganda, in which their definition of habeas corpus does fit into what that word means, but they only present theirs and not others. That law, of course, which they're talking about is corporate law and is not constitutional. The word habeas corpus is included in the Constitution, but does not equally apply to their definition of that word. And here you get the second paragraph, which is attempting to subvert the constitutional form of that, which is the writ of habeas corpus was described in the 18th century by William Blackstone as a great or efficacious writ in all manner of illegal confinement. That's wrong, because habeas corpus simply means having the body and doesn't necessarily have to do with legality, which is something reduced to writing. A writ would have to do with legality, but habeas corpus itself does not. Anyway, it is a summons with the force of a court order. It is addressed, or this is a version. Now, they're presenting it like the only version, but it is not. It is a version, and it's an unlawful version, specifically. Anyway, it is addressed to the custodian or prison official, for example, and demands that a prisoner be brought before the court and that the custodian present proof of authority. Again, this is only one version, allowing the court to determine whether the custodian has lawful authority to detain the prisoner. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. The rest of this is a waste of time. Habeas corpus just means having the body, and a writ of habeas corpus is simply a letter stating you have the body, essentially, or demanding release. So yeah, that's basically what a writ of habeas corpus is. It's essentially when somebody is taken or captured, they have a document made up stating that that person is has been taken and that they must be released. Now, these are the corporate versions of the writ of habeas corpus, where everything involved in their system is all subject to them and not the constitutional law, but rather their corporate law. And normally, when they hold somebody, their person, it's out of surety or something like that. And yeah, their laws are subject only to them, whereas the Constitution is not. So this takes us to the particular section in the Constitution that says, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when, in cases of rebellion or invasion, public safety may require it. So that's basically just stating a practical concern, which is that you don't have the time to write up this particular document in the case of essentially warfare. So that's the only section in which it can be suspended, and it has to do specifically with those individuals who are enforcing and on the side of the Constitution. These corporate people, they're not on the side of the Constitution. They simply do things under the color or name of it, but they don't actually have to follow it because they are contrary to it and therefore enemies of it. So this passage only applies to the actual enforcers of the Constitution. This does not apply to them because they don't follow it. Pretty simple. A municipal corporation is the legal term for a local governing body, including but not necessarily limited to cities, counties, towns, townships, charter townships, villages, and boroughs. The term can also be used to describe municipally owned corporations. That is a very misleading definition, as with everything on Wikipedia. It's a term for a city corporation, being a municipality, right? It's a corporation being a business. Legal term simply means a term that is written on paper. So those are some of the tricks they're doing with the wording here. Also, it states municipal corporations, local self-government. Municipal corporation occurs when such municipalities become self-governing entities under the laws of the state or province in which they are located. Often this event is marked by the award or declaration of a municipal charter. City charter or town charter or municipal charter is a legal document establishing municipality such as a city or town. So the word there, incorporation, means it is being put into body, right? Incorporated, usually as part of as a subsidiary, essentially, of a larger entity. So in this case, the municipal corporations are the founding entities of state government corporations, none of which, of course, are constitutional or lawful in that manner. They are all corporate. This is the reason why when you're driving on the highways, you will often come to these signs saying corporate limit or leaving corporate limit. So that is a boundary of a corporation being a business entity, fraudulently occupying the territory in opposition to the law of the land and everything else. And these entities are the founding ones, the ones that support and prop up the main corporate entity, which we call a state government, which it's not. It's not a real, anyway, it's not a lawful constitutional government. All they do is act in the name of it, but they do basically whatever they want because they are corporations, they are businesses, they do not value our law or the people. Now we find private military company. A private military company, PMC, or private military and security company, PMSC, is a private company providing armed combat or security services for financial gain. PMCs referred to their personnel as security contractors or private military contractors. Of course, as usual, they are presenting only one example as though it's the only one, when in fact there are many other ones that can be included. Services and expertise offered by PMCs are typically similar to those of governmental security, military, or police, but most often on a smaller scale. How about this? Most security and police fit into this category specifically. PMCs often provide services to train or supplement official armed forces in service of governments, but they can also be employed by private companies to provide bodyguards for key staff or protection of company premises, especially in hostile territories. However, contractors that use armed force in a war zone may be considered unlawful combatants in reference to a concept that is outlined in the Geneva Conventions and explicitly stated by 2006 American Military Commissions Act. Naturally, they do not recognize any other versions except their own manipulated one. They also do not recognize the Constitution. They never do, and they never will. The state troopers are uniformed armed forces. You see them marching here, but you also see them out and about in uniforms with arms enforcing corporate laws, not constitutional laws, mind you, corporate laws. And naturally, you have all of the municipal police who go out and about in uniforms under arms. That makes them uniformed armed forces. Interestingly enough, they are not the U.S. uniformed armed forces. So what kind of armed forces are they? Here you're looking at private, corporate, uniformed forces under arms. Militia. A militia is generally an army or some other fighting organization of non-professional and or part-time soldiers, citizens of a country, or subjects of a state, who may perform military service during a time of need, as opposed to a professional force of regular full-time military personnel, or historically to members of a warrior nobility class, knights or samurai. When acting independently, militias are generally unable to hold ground against regular forces. Militias commonly support regular troops by skirmishing, holding fortifications, or conducting irregular warfare, instead of undertaking offensive campaigns by themselves. Local civilians often limit militias to serve only in their home region and to serve only for a limited time. This further reduces their use in long military campaigns. Militias may also, however, serve as a pool of available manpower for regular forces to draw from, particularly in emergencies. Beginning in the late 20th century, some militias, and particularly officially recognized and sanctioned militias of a government, act as professional forces while still being part-time or on-call organizations. For instance, the members of the United States National Guard units are considered professional soldiers as they are trained to the same standards that their full-time active duty counterparts are. So this is obviously written by somebody who has no concept of what they're talking about. And they are being incredibly manipulative in their wording here. A militia is simply a body of those capable of fighting, essentially. And historically, it has been the case. And yes, militias, so-called, can hold their ground against regular forces, considering often regular forces comprise the militia, or a component of the militia. So we'll have to look into that further. However, the United States National Guard is not militia. That is an issue with the obfuscation of the term militia to mean a specific component that is controlled under land forces. It's very important that we know these distinctions when it comes to the Constitution. When it comes to corporate governance, well, they can make up whatever they want as long as it benefits the corporation. Anything that gives them control, them the ability to extort, oppress, threaten, steal, do whatever they want as far as their business goes, that is what they will do. They will not respect the Constitution. And here, of course, we have a picture of the Hempstead Rifles Volunteer Militia Company from Arkadelphia, Arkansas, 1861. Now, fortunately, the Constitution makes its own definition of what a militia is. Under the Second Amendment, it states, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That, therefore, tells you that the militia in the Constitution is comprised of the people with essentially the ability to keep and bear arms. Both of those are important. Anybody who can bear arms is part of the militia. And that, of course, explains why there's so much effort to diminish people's ability to bear arms and keep them, of course. If they can keep them, they might not be able to bear them and therefore will not be part of the militia. So if you make people sick and weak and incapable, you can diminish the numbers in a militia and, of course, make the fighting capabilities of the region much less. And the fighting capabilities of the region are important for a specific reason in the Constitution. Here you see it. To provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. That is the constitutional component of law enforcement. The militia, or the people who can keep and bear arms, they are the ones that are supposed to go and execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. That means that if we want to fix anything, it requires the calling forth of the militia to execute the laws, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. At this point, what we're looking at is the suppression of the corporate insurrection of municipal corporations and state corporations that are leveraging their own laws in the face of the Constitution. They have to be suppressed by the combined arms of the militia and other constitutional components, who we'll look at. Well, specifically the militia. The militia constitutionally is the only law enforcement component listed that's allowed to operate. So all of these other so-called law enforcement components that are going around, they don't have any lawful authority whatsoever. The only people who have the lawful authority to act is the people, and specifically those people that can keep and bear arms. Now, most of the old depictions of the colonial militias have included people in regular civilian attire. So that is where you get the differentiation, or the difference, right? The militia, being the people, are the law enforcement component in the Constitution, and they are not uniformed. That is how you know the State National Guard is not the militia, because they bear uniforms. That's how you also know the police and the state troopers and all of those corporate thugs and the border protection and all of them, they are not militia either. And they are also not U.S. uniformed armed forces. They are corporate uniformed armed forces, and they are inherently in opposition to both the militia and the U.S. Armed Forces, because they are not allowed to operate constitutionally, which is a document to which everybody who joins the military swears allegiance. Now, this other section in the Constitution is very important for the context of this video and many others. There it states, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So, most of what intellectual property is, it usually has to do with a specific section in the Constitution called, or where it talks about the deprivation deprivation of property. Deprivation of property without due process. However, these publishing companies and these so-called these state and federal and all of these different named regulatory bodies and all of these private corporations, of which the state government and municipal governments or corporations, they're all private corporations. They're in the hands of a specific board of trustees, which we call city council and all that, for foreign interests, foreign investors and whatnot, especially with border protection and immigration and all of them. So all of these entities, when they revise and censor writings and discoveries, especially when it comes to the suppression of technology, they are not violating the intellectual property clause. Well, they're not just violating the intellectual property clause, because usually the argument they make is that if somebody's like a ghostwriter or something and they write something and they sell it, well, that property has been taken by a company or whatever, so they can use it with any way they want. No, they can't. They can use it any way they want right now because the militia is not going out and suppressing this corporate insurrection that has happened and has been going on for a while. However, all of those people are committing the crime of violating this section of the Constitution of the exclusive right to writings. If they even change a typo, that will violate exclusivity to a writer. And, of course, when they suppress technologies and when they obfuscate and hide different discoveries, when you have corporate government forces that go in and take somebody's invention saying it's too dangerous, they are violating the exclusivity to discovery. All individuals involved, especially universities, in revisionism or censorship, all of them are committing criminal offense that has to be dealt with when the militias are called forth, or the militia, specifically constitutional militia, is called forth. And it has to be done, because left to stand, all of these corporate entities that go around rob and steal and destroy and pillage, they're going to destroy everything they can. And if they are not dealt with, then we will be living in the ashes, essentially. Here we look at the United States Armed Forces on Wikipedia. United States Armed Forces are the military forces of the United States. The Armed Forces consists of 6 service branches: the Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force, Space Force, and Coast Guard. All 6 armed forces are among the 8 uniformed services of the United States. Notice that they state the United States Armed Forces, but they never include the citizen militia. They only ever include the uniformed services. So this person who's writing it, they might be ignorant, but the person who trained them and coordinated all of this corporate propaganda nonsense, they knew what they were doing. They knew that there is a distinction between uniformed and non-uniformed. So that's why they state the United States Armed Forces are among the 8 uniformed services of the United States. So there are others, they just don't include them here. They just don't recognize them. They pretend they don't exist. And that other one is the constitutional citizen militia. Anyway, each of the different military services is assigned a role and domain. Yes, of course, assigned, right? Not by the Constitution. The Constitution does assign it, but that's not who's assigning it right now. The Army conducts land operations while the Navy and Marine Corps conduct maritime operations, with the Marine Corps specializing in amphibious maritime littoral operations in support of the Navy. The Air Force conducts air operations and the Space Force conducts space operations. Coast Guard is unique in that it both specializes in maritime operations and is also a law enforcement agency. Makes you wonder, of course, which law? From their inception during the American Revolution, the U.S. Armed Forces have played a decisive role in the country's history. Well, that's obvious. They helped forge a sense of national unity and identity through victories in the early 19th century, First and Second Barbary Wars. They played a critical role in the territorial evolution of the U.S., including the American Civil War. The National Security Act of 1947 created the modern U.S. military framework, establishing a national military establishment, later the Department of Defense, or DoD, headed by the Secretary of Defense, and creating both a U.S. Air Force and National Security Council. In 1949, an amendment to the Act merged the cabinet-level departments of the Army, Navy, and Air Force into the DoD. So there you go. 1947 is when the uniformed, specifically, armed forces were taken away and put under the guidance, I guess you could say, or rather the directive, of an unlawful corporate agency. That's when we lost the capabilities and the support of the uniformed forces for the true law enforcement, the militia, citizen militia. The President of the U.S. is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and forms military policy with the DoD and Department of Homeland Security, DHS, both federal executive departments altogether acting as the principal organs by which military policy is carried out. Now, isn't that interesting? That is, so 1947 is the year in which the corporate structure took over the uniformed armed forces and subsequently took over the country by force as the ultimate, or I suppose the final stage, one of them anyway. There's so many different stages, but either way, the corporate insurrection was going on through the Civil War. As an added note, it's important to know that considering the fact that the Constitution only allows for one constitutional law enforcement component, that is the militia, that means that when the uniformed armed forces support the militia, they are in fact subordinate to the militia. The militia is the only entity allowed constitutionally to operate. None of these corporate, so-called law enforcement entities are lawful. None of them are allowed to operate. There's only one, and that one is superior to the uniformed armed forces when it comes to the defense and the laws of the nation. Now, when we look at the so-called 7 branches of the so-called U.S. uniformed armed forces, we'll notice that down at National Guard you have a representation, anyway, of a much older time in which the citizen militia went out under arms and they weren't uniformed. But the National Guard today wears the uniform of the Army. That's very important to notice. Under the Fifth Amendment, it states, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia. Notice that. Land or naval forces or in the militia. That is where you get a distinction in the Constitution between the 3 elements, and in fact tells you there are only 3 elements allowed lawfully to operate constitutionally. The land being the Army, or the Navy, naval forces being the Navy, or the militia, the armed citizenry. Those are the only 3. The Air Force, Coast Guard, and all of these others, other than the Army and Navy, none of them constitutionally or lawfully are allowed to exist. None of them. And the land forces would include, of course, the National Guard, with the Army and anyone else who operates on the land, whereas the naval forces, of course, are the ones that operate on the sea, in the water, on the rivers, etc. Anyway, when in actual service in time of war or public danger, nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. The important element in this section of the Constitution is to note that it essentially gives you the ability to violate the Constitution as only a component of the land or naval forces or the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. I would certainly say that having an insurrectionist corporation going around maiming, murdering, looting, burning, destroying, stealing, harassing, extorting, and doing all these other things that the cities and the so-called federal agencies and state agencies and all these corporate Gestapo thugs go around doing, that constitutes a time of public danger. And it also constitutes a time of war. Here, you do not need the presentment or indictment of a grand jury to try someone on an otherwise infamous or capital crime, because we are in such a time. Of course, you have to be a member in the militia, being this armed, the people capable of keeping and bearing arms, or in the land or naval forces. No random person can just willy-nilly go out and do whatever they want, especially these corporate thugs and agents. They do this stuff in the face of, because they are, in fact, in opposition to the Constitution. Now, we look at the oath of enlistment, or, I mean, not the oath of enlistment, the oath of the commander-in-chief that's stipulated in the Constitution. It states, before he enter on the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So there you understand that the Commander-in-Chief is equally bound to the document and cannot go around doing anything that they want. The Commander-in-Chief is not law enforcement. The judicial component in the Constitution is not law enforcement, and the Congress is not law enforcement. Neither of those three entities can stipulate who can be law enforcement, because the Constitution itself stipulates only one component that can be law enforcement. That's the militia. That means that the president, if he's going to faithfully preserve and protect and defend the Constitution, that means he has to adhere to all of the sections in it, including that section stipulating the only component allowed to enforce the laws. Now, the purpose of the Constitution is found in the preamble. It states, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish the Constitution for the United States. So, among all of the other elements, the uniform, the municipal codes, and all the corporate regulations and all that stuff, the other way to identify who is on the side of the Constitution or not, whether or not they're acting under the name of it, is whether or not they're following the purpose set out in the preamble. One of those is to ensure domestic tranquility. When you go harass and extort and steal people's stuff, especially through that so feloniously called income tax and sales tax, when you use the Constitution as your excuse to go around and violate it constantly, but when, and more importantly, you take actions that lead to conflict, then you are violating the domestic tranquility clause of the preamble. On the other hand, if everything you do, including armed resistance, is to establish domestic tranquility, then you're clearly on the side of the Constitution. So that's an interesting thing to think about when it comes to the so-called conflict at the border. Thank you. If you have enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and check out all my other content.